just be going through a brief introduction of the things that you may want to be looking for as Cornell employees or researchers or whatnot. So we will jump right in. Export control laws. So these are laws, not regulations. And I get that a lot. Well, this is really the law. Yeah, it's the law. They restrict the release of commodities, software, technology, and information that may have military, security, or strategic use. So that's kind of the rationale behind why the government restricts what it does. Export control laws apply not only to transfers out of the country. So when a lot of people think of export control, they think, oh, physical shipments, but they also apply to some in-country transfers. They apply to US citizens everywhere in the world, and they apply to everyone in the United States, regardless of citizenship. So what are those regulations? The International Traffic in Arms Regulation, or ITAR. This is administered by the Department of State, and it regulates the exchange of security and defense articles and the related technical data. So the ITAR controls the highly classified export control items. These are US defense technologies, and they have primarily military purposes. However, ITAR controlled items can be procured from commercial vendors. So I always tell people, you know, if you see ITAR on something, you should definitely be coming and talking to me because they are really highly controlled. The next set of regulations is the Office of Foreign Asset Control Regulations, otherwise known as OFAC. These are administered by the US Treasury Department. The Treasury Department enforces these economic and trade sanctions and embargoes based on US foreign policy and national security goals. So when you hear about, you know, we're sanctioning Venezuela or we're sanctioning Syria because of their human rights abuses, this is the set of regulations that those sanctions fall under. And OFAC regulations are not directed at specific technologies or items, but they're rather targeted at the end user or the individual. So they can target a person, they can target an entity, and they can target a country. Now, typically sanctions and embargoes, they restrict the transfer and exchange of anything of value with a sanctioned entity. So the point of sanctions and embargoes is to kind of cut off the lifeline to these restricted entities to cause them a certain amount of pain, so they will stop the undesirable behavior. So when we think of sanctions and embargoes, one of the important things we need to remember for Cornell purposes is they do restrict travel to certain countries, and we will get into that later. And then they also restrict relationships with certain entities, which is why we do our visual compliance screening, for those of you that are familiar with that, and we will talk about that later. Yes, we'll jump on. So the last set of regulations that I want to talk about is the Export Administration Regulations, otherwise known as the EAR. These are administered by the Department of Commerce and by an agency under the Department of Commerce known as the Bureau of Industry and Security. And these regulations regulate dual use articles. So this is anything that has a potentially commercial as well as a military or security application. Controlled items are identified on what we call the Commerce Control List, otherwise known as the CCL. And these are definitely the most important regulation to know about when we're talking about, well, really for anybody in the United States, because the EAR regulates everything. And when I say everything, I mean almost everything. So for example, pens and pencils are regulated under the EAR. So, you know, we'll talk about more about what that means to you and your specific job, but there is a lot of training out there, a lot of resources to help understand what is and what isn't regulated. And of course, for your purposes, you just come to me and I can help you navigate that. So what is subject to the regulations? Every commodity in the United States is subject to the regulations, regardless of who designed it, regardless of where it came from. Once it enters the United States, it is subject to our export control laws. So if somebody ships you something from Japan and you want to send it back to them, you still have to follow US export control laws, regardless of whether or not that item was made in Japan. some items located outside of the US. So if it has US technology, and there's a certain threshold depending on the type of technology we're talking about, so it might be 10% US technology or as high as 25% US technology in some cases, we're still going to regulate that item if it has some sort of US content. Activities of US and foreign persons, and I already mentioned this, but everyone in the US and US citizens abroad. So this is important for our international campuses. Those international campuses, if you're on one of them, they are still a US person under the export control regulations, and they still have to abide by US export control laws, regardless of the fact that they are situated outside of the United States. All right, what does it mean to export? So we talked earlier, I said, you know, an export can be a shipment. And I hear a lot, well, I don't have to worry about export control because I don't ship anything out of the country. And that's actually not true because they apply to a lot more than just shipments. An export can be an oral disclosure of information. It can be written, it can be electronic. An export can be sent, an export can be made via sending control technology over an email. It can be a visual disclosure, pulling up controlled design specifications on your computer and sharing those with an international audience could be an export control violation. And again, an export can be made. How do you export? An export is made to anyone outside the US, including a US citizen. So kind of like I said earlier, when you're outside of the US as a US citizen, you still have to abide by the export control laws. If I leave the US and I go to China and I'm a US citizen and another US citizen in the US wants to email me control technology, in that case, I'm actually treated like a Chinese citizen because I am in China. So anyone outside of the US, including US citizens, is subject to receiving an export from the US. A foreign national in the US or abroad can be the recipient of export controlled information, or can receive an export in violation of the export control regulations. An export to a foreign embassy in the United States can be an export violation. Who is a foreign national? When I say foreign national, what am I talking about? A foreign national is any person who is not a US citizen, a green card holder, or a protected individual. Protected individual status is very rare, but it's asylum, people that have been granted asylum or refugee status. Okay, deemed exports, very important topic. A deemed export means the release of technology to a foreign national in the United States is deemed to be an export to the home country of that foreign national. Under the EAR and the Itar, technology is controlled. And technology is the information used to make a controlled product. So releasing that controlled technology to a foreign national in the US is deemed to be an export to that foreign national's home country. More on that. How are deemed exports disclosed? A deemed export can happen via a telephone conversation, an email communication, a fax. It can be done via computer or network access. And this is important. So I've been reviewing a lot of situations during the pandemic where we have foreign nationals that are working abroad and they need authorization to work abroad. And one of the first questions I ask is, are they going to have access to a server that contains any sort of controlled technology on it? Because just giving them access to that server could constitute an export control violation, even if that server is in the US. Face-to-face discussions, obviously training sessions, tours which involve visual inspections, hosting a foreign scientist. So again, the concept of deemed export is the release of technology / information to a foreign national, regardless of where they are located. So you're thinking, oh God, okay, so what's going on here? Are we constantly breaking export control laws when we are disclosing things to foreign nationals? Probably not, in the sake of Cornell, and I will explain why. So how do you go about exporting something that's subject to one of these regulations? Well, the obvious choice is you can get a license, and I would be the one to apply for that license on behalf of Cornell. We can apply for a license from the Department of Commerce for EAR controlled items. Like I said earlier, these are the most common. The license turnaround time is about 30 to 60 days, and they are fairly routine and fairly straightforward. The Department of State, Itar controlled items, this is going to be a little longer time, about 90 days. Department of Treasury, Ofac, if you want a license to engage in a sanctioned party, you're probably looking about a year turnaround or more. I just did an Ofac license for someone in Iran, and it took 14 months to get the license back. So again, I'm the one to make those applications, so come to me if you think you might need one. Another way that we export things under the regulations is general licenses. So these are licenses that are already built right into the regulations. So for example, if you have ever traveled to Cuba on Cornell business, obviously pre-pandemic, you went under a license that's built into the Cuban sanctions. So I won't go into too much detail here, but Cuba is a comprehensively sanctioned country, which means that US citizens cannot travel to Cuba without a license. However, there is a general license built right into the regulations that permits travel to Cuba for very specific reasons. One of them being there's an educational license, and there are a lot of boxes we have to check prior to utilizing that. But know that if you have gone to Cuba and you follow the correct procedures, that there are a lot of checks made ahead of time to make sure that that general license terms were fulfilled and were able to be used for your trip. Exclusions, exemptions, and exceptions. So these are the most obvious ways that we are I don't want to say getting around the export control laws, but that we are exempted or excluded from export control regulations. And so we'll talk about those a little bit more. So the regulations cover nearly everything. And I've mentioned that they cover travel, they cover pens, they cover pencils, they cover financial transactions, transfers of money. They cover a lot of things. But exclusions are really important to how Cornell and other institutes of higher education do business. And the most important of those exclusions is the fundamental research exclusion. And I will talk more about that, but I want to quickly touch on the other two. Educational information. So when you're teaching a class, and I'm going to take an example, let's say I'm teaching a physics class. The regulations say that information released in the course of that class that is natural to that class content is excluded from export control regulations. So if I teach a physics class and I teach, basic physics principles, some of which are probably export controlled were it not for this educational information exemption, I'm excluded from the regulation. So if I have foreign nationals sitting in my class, that's why I'm not committing a violation when I do that. It's because of this exclusion that's written into the regulations. However, if I teach music and I decide to teach physics content to my music class and I have foreign nationals in that class, I don't get to avail myself of that exclusion because it's a music class and you're not supposed to be teaching physics in a music class. The other exclusion that's important to know is publicly available public domain information. So if it's published, if it's already out there in the public domain, and I say out there, meaning it needs to be publicly available without restriction, then it's not subject to the regulations. So let's go back and talk about the fundamental research exclusion. This definition right here is from the regulations, and it says fundamental research is basic and applied research in science and engineering, the results of which are ordinarily published and shared broadly with the scientific community. This is distinguished from proprietary research and from industry type design, development, and production. So if your research falls under and qualifies for the fundamental research exclusion as per the regulations, you are excluded from export control regulations. So what does that really mean? In order to qualify as fundamental research, the research must be conducted free of any publication or dissemination restrictions and without any national security related access restrictions. So what does that mean? That means that when you have a sponsored research agreement and there is a clause that says you are not allowed to publish your work or that your work is proprietary to the sponsor, you are going to lose the fundamental research exclusion. And I have another slide on that. But alternatively, the point of the fundamental research exclusion was to say that in these instances where we are doing research and the intent is to broadly share that research to benefit the greater good, to benefit the scientific community and the general knowledge base, then the government recognizes that that serves a higher purpose and has said that that's going to be excluded from the export control regulations. But again, you need to meet that intent of the fundamental research exclusion. So we can't circumvent that intent and then still claim the exclusion. Now, this applies only to the dissemination of research data and information. This does not apply to goods. So if you are shipping something outside of the country, if you've developed some sort of genetic material under your fundamental research project, and you want to ship it to the UK, you probably are going to need an export license for that. Not difficult to get, but just know that you do not get to use the fundamental research exclusion for shipments. Okay, so fundamental research exclusion. How do I lose that? Now, remember, if you're not doing fundamental research, your research, especially if you're working in a scientific or an engineering field, is likely export controlled, meaning you cannot share it with foreign nationals with certain foreign nationals, depending on what the technology is, without a license. So this fundamental research exclusion is extremely important to what we do at Cornell and for maintaining, obviously, compliance with this very important law. Now, the fundamental research exclusion is lost, it's destroyed by any clause that gives the sponsor the right to approve or disapprove publications. So if I have General Electric sponsoring my research and they put a clause in there that says, your work is fundamental research, you can publish it, but General Electric needs to review and approve any publication before it's released. You've lost the fundamental research exclusion. It doesn't matter that you have the right to publish. It doesn't matter that they actually said it was fundamental research in the contract. If you accept a clause that allows them the right to approve or disapprove the publication, we cannot use the fundamental research exclusion anymore. Your work becomes subject to export control regulations. So very important. I say this in every training. So if you've listened to me talk before, you've heard this before, but give your grant and contract officers some patience and when they're negotiating these contracts, because that's one of the big ones we get stuck on. Sponsors say, we're paying for the research, we should have the right to approve your publication before it goes out. And I say, nope, sorry. Otherwise, we could be likely doing export controlled work, and that's not something Cornell does. And obviously, if you can't publish, you cannot avail yourself of the fundamental research exclusion. Another way you can lose the fundamental research exclusion is if it restricts participation in the conduct of the research and this is right out of the regulations, for proprietary or national security reasons, excuse me. So what this has been mostly translated to mean, if foreign nationals are restricted from participating in the research, it cannot be fundamental research. Now, there are a lot of caveats to this one. The regulations say you lose the fundamental research exclusion if the citizenship restriction is for proprietary or national security reasons, meaning you've accepted, let's say, a contract, and it says only US citizens can participate in this. And we dig a little deeper and we say, why is this exclusion in there of foreign nationals? And they say, it's because this is highly proprietary research that we think might have a military or security application down the road, and we don't want foreign nationals accessing it. Well, okay, that's not fundamental research. That makes a lot of sense. So we don't accept citizenship restrictions, not just because of the fundamental research exclusion, but also policy reasons. Now, we are seeing government contracts that are really pushing this boundary. They have foreign national approval and disapproval clauses. And I won't go into that right now because that could be a whole separate training on its own. But know that we have done a ton of work behind the scenes on this with OSP, with counsel's office, with outside counsel. And there is a very specific procedure that is put in place to allow us to maintain the fundamental research exclusion, accept certain government contracts with citizenship restrictions, and still be able to move forward. Now, like I said, it's a very detailed and intricate process. And again, I just encourage you to have patience while your OSP grant and contract officer works through that process with you. All right, license exceptions under the EAR, the Export Administration Regulations. Now remember, these are the regulations that control everything. Computers, cell phones, pens, pencils, you name it, EAR controls it. There are a lot of exceptions written into the EAR. And one of the first and most important exceptions is what we call the TMP exception, temporary exports. And this basically says that if you are taking something outside of the country, it's going to stay in your control for the whole time. You're not going to be giving it to a foreign national. You're going to return to the US within 12 months, and you're not going to a comprehensively sanctioned country, more on that later, then you get an exclusion from the export control regulations under this TMP exception. So I bet a lot of you didn't realize this, but when you travel to a foreign country and you bring your cell phone or your computer, you are actually utilizing this TMP exception to allow those items to leave the country, because that's actually an export. BAG, baggage exemption. This is also very similar, except this controls personal use items. So things like toiletries, beauty products, hairsprays that might have controlled content in them. When you're traveling, again, it's for personal use, you're bringing it back with you. You probably get to use this BAG exemption. Gift parcels and humanitarian donations. This is the exemption that allows us to make foreign aid donations and tends to send certain gifts. But if you think you want to utilize this exemption, talk to me, because you can't gift a nuclear weapon to someone in Iran. Not that anyone here would do that, but there are a lot of boxes you have to check before utilizing that exemption. Consumer communication devices. I bring this one up because, social media is a really obviously big thing right now. So what allows a Facebook to put out messenger applications and allow individuals in foreign countries to use those applications, even though Facebook is in the US? Well, a lot of that falls under the consumer communication devices exemption. And finally, servicing and replacement of parts and equipment. Now, I mentioned earlier that if you receive something from Japan and you send it back to Japan, that's actually an export. If you buy something from Japan and it arrives and it's defective and you need to send it back to be repaired, we can likely utilize this exemption for that. Now, you can't send it back to be enhanced, and if you've made changes to it, you can't utilize it. So again, I won't go into a lot of details, but just know that that exemption is available. Use of these exemptions should be approved by me. They are mostly very detailed, and there are a lot of steps and boxes we have to check. So again, come to me if you ever want to utilize one of these, or if you have a question about it. Of course, the mailman comes at 10 o'clock, gets my dog all excited. So, okay. There are also Itar exemptions and general licenses, but those are very, very few and far between, and we shouldn't be really doing Itar stuff here anyway. So we will deal with that on a case-by-case basis if needed. Okay, penalties for violations and non-compliance. I always struggle when I do this slide because I want to strike that fine balance between conveying the message that these are extremely serious obligations, but not completely scaring everybody. So what are the penalties for violations and non-compliance? Administrative penalties, termination of export privileges. You could, as an individual or as an institution, lose your ability to ever export anything from the United States. That includes something you take with you on a business trip. You could be suspended or debarred from government contracting. That would be pretty disastrous for Cornell, obviously. There can also be substantial monetary fines. And when I say substantial, I mean millions and millions and millions of dollars. And these are for administrative penalties. These are, again, unintentional. We just messed it up. Criminal and civil penalties. Now, these are going to apply to willful violations. These are going to apply when you come to me, not that anyone here would ever do this, but let's say some random person comes to me and says, Sarah, I have this piece of equipment that I want to ship to China, and can I do that without a license? And I say, no, you cannot. We have to get a license for that. and then I don't hear from you and you go and ship it to China anyway. That's a willful violation of export control regulations. Willful violations can include prison time, they can include substantial fines, or both. And these are levied against both the individual and the organization. So just because you are working as a Cornell employee, if you commit a willful violation of export control regulations, the government can and will come after you personally as well. Quick case in point, there was a faculty at University of Tennessee, not many, it was, I think in 2012, he had export controlled information in his lab. He consulted with his export control officer who told him, you cannot share that information with your foreign students in your lab. He shared it with them anyway. He also traveled with export controlled information on his laptop to China, which he could not do in this case. And the government prosecuted him. He himself spent 4 years in jail for that. So obviously that was very significant, and that shows you that this is not a small thing. Voluntary disclosures can serve as a mitigating factor. So if you think that there might be a violation, don't hide it. Please come to me. And like I said, it might make sense to voluntarily disclose it to the government. So how do we manage export control at Cornell? The general principles here are this. I am Cornell's export control officer, and I am one person. So each department and individual is responsible for compliance. When in doubt, come to me. That's the general principle. International travel. What do we do about international travel here at Cornell? So as I mentioned earlier, Ofac administers those sanctions and embargoes based on US foreign policy. And because of those sanctions and embargoes, travel to certain destinations is actually illegal without a specific or general license. So right now, the really hot destinations that I'm reviewing and approving are Cuba, North Korea, Syria, Sudan, Ukraine, the Crimea region of Ukraine, and Venezuela. Now, of those 7 countries that I just named, only Cuba, North Korea, Syria, the Crimea region of the Ukraine, and Iran. So I think I missed Iran. Iran are comprehensively sanctioned countries. That means you can absolutely not engage in any transactions with those countries without utilizing a specific or general license. Sudan was comprehensively sanctioned. They have recently been removed from the list, but there still are a number of sanctions that apply to to Sudan. So I would obviously like to review all travel to Sudan as well. Same thing with Venezuela. They're not considered a comprehensively embargoed country, but there are a lot of sanctions that apply to Venezuela right now. So I would ask to review and approve all travel there as well. Again, when travel opens back up. Cornell's International Travel Registry. This is one of the greatest tools we have at Cornell for ensuring compliance with sanctions and embargoes. The travel registry is mandatory for everyone traveling internationally. And this just became a mandatory requirement about 6 or 8 months ago. So that's a new thing. So faculty, student, anyone traveling internationally on Cornell business has to register in this travel registry. And this is important, and it helps both you and the institution, because if you register to go to one of these high-risk countries, I'm going to get a notification. So we can make sure you have the right licenses in place to do that, or we can make sure you're not going to get stopped at the border and be in a really difficult situation. Cuba-specific process, I touched on this earlier, so I won't go into great detail, but again, when things open back up, there is a very specific process for those traveling to Cuba. So I just put the webpage here, and of course you can always come to me if you think that's going to be applicable to you. A couple years ago, about a year and a half ago, we had a situation where a faculty member had traveled to Iran during her sabbatical. She attended a conference in Iran, and she came back and submitted that trip for reimbursement because the conference applied to her job and was applicable for her teaching. The Business Service Center approved her request for reimbursement. They submitted it to the bank. we got a call from the bank that said, we noticed that this was for travel to Iran. We think this is in violation of Ofac sanctions, and we're going to report you to the government. Incidentally, banks are actually under a duty to report suspected violations to the government. So this came back to me, and of course, we ended up submitting a voluntary disclosure to the government. We said, yes, she traveled to Iran. She did things in Iran that she did not have a license to do. We messed up, and we, long story short, after outside counsel time and a lot of back and forth, we were let off with a warning letter. That is certainly not a guarantee that that's going to happen in all cases. Another important thing to mention about this is that common carriers or airlines or travel agencies are not under any sort of obligation to verify whether or not you have a license to travel to these countries. So if you go to Expedia, if you go to, I'm trying to think of a major air, United, Delta, and you book a trip to Iran, they're not going to ask you if you have a license. It's not their job. It's your job to make sure that you're following the regulations. So something to be cautious of there. Items taken abroad. So I kind of touched on this earlier, but remember that when you leave the United States, anything taken with you, whether it's technology on your computer or the computer itself, is considered an export. So if you want to travel abroad and you want to bring those things with you, as I mentioned earlier, you're probably utilizing what we call the TMP exception. And items such as cell phones, computers, and most commercial software programs installed on those computers are eligible to utilize this TMP exception. And again, the requirements for that is that you return within 1 year with that item, you retain control over the item while you're abroad. And we also, it's not required, but I recommend that you carry a Tmp letter with you. This is something that is on the export control website. And if you don't know, the link to the website will be at the end of the presentation. And of course, always just reach out to me for it. This is a Tmp letter that if you ever did get questioned with what you're leaving the country with, it's a letter that says, I'm bringing these items outside of the country. I'm only going to be abroad for 12 months or less. I'm going to retain control over them. And I'm not going to a sanctioned country, and I'll take a look at it and I'll say, yeah, you're good to go. So again, this letter is not required, but it's helpful to carry it with you. So if you ever do run into questions or ever do have a problem, you have that letter, and it's just additional documentation that you're utilizing the TMP exception. The TMP exception is not available for travel to sanctioned countries. So again, that's going to be Iran, Cuba, North Korea, Syria, and the Crimea region of the Ukraine. So even if you're traveling to Cuba on that Cuba specific process we have, you cannot bring controlled items with you under the TMP license exception because it's a sanctioned country. Same thing, if you have, if we were going to apply for a license for you to travel to Iran, I would include in that license application permission for you to also bring your cell phone or laptop if you wanted to do that, because just having a license to travel to one of those countries does not allow you to bring export controlled items to those countries. Travel to China, Russia, and Venezuela as of about 10 months ago requires an additional filing regarding items that you are bringing abroad. So remember how I said register in that travel registry? If you are traveling to one of those countries, you're going to register your travel in the travel registry. You're going to get an email prompt that's going to tell you that an additional filing needs to be made for items you are taking with you to that country. I can help you with that. There are instructions, like I said, in the travel registry when you go in there. There's also instructions on our website, and of course I'm here to talk through that in additional details. If possible, consider taking loaner devices. I have the website here for IT's high-risk travel loaner program. So I highly encourage you to check that out if you're traveling to a high-risk destination other than a sanctioned country, which you can't bring one of those computers to anyway without a license. And also, it's very common that different departments have a loaner program as well. So talk to your department administrator. Okay, proprietary information on Cornell's campus. So this is third-party information that we receive likely under a non-disclosure agreement, but even if we don't have a non-disclosure agreement, there are certainly cases where an entity will give you something and then it's marked proprietary or confidential or something along those lines. Third-party proprietary information is not protected by this fundamental research exclusion. So remember earlier when I said that Cornell's research is likely considered fundamental because we have the ability to publish and we don't accept restrictions. That does not apply to third-party information that we use to do our research. So if you're working under a fundamental research project, and then you also receive proprietary information from the sponsor. Let's go back to that General Electric example. They're sponsoring your research, and they also give you some drawings to help you do your research. Those drawings don't fall under the fundamental research exclusion, and they could be and are likely, if it's General Electric, frankly, export controlled. So again, third-party information not protected by the fundamental research exclusion. So if you're receiving proprietary technical information, which I would define as technology for the development, design, production, or use of a controlled item, should always be treated as controlled, meaning access by certain foreign nationals in the US is prohibited. And that doesn't mean overinterpret this and say, that's it, no foreign national can have access to anything I'm working with. That means come to me, check with me, and we will determine if you're working with controlled information. And I also say work with the grant contract officer on this, because now remember, all non-disclosure agreements for research need to go through OSP. And again, this is to protect everyone, including the researchers. If you come through OSP, if you bring your non-disclosure agreement through OSP, your grant contract officer is going to make sure the terms in there are favorable to not receiving controlled information. So if you use our standard template, you'll see there's language in there that says, you will not give us any export controlled information under this NDA. And that's obviously why that's in there, is to protect us from an export control violation. So another case example I will use from Cornell is a couple of years ago, we found out that there was a lab that had some proprietary third-party information that they were working with to do their research. They had received it under an NDA. This information was not marked as export controlled. It was not identified to us as being export controlled, but it was identified as being proprietary, and it was in fact export controlled, and we had been working with it for many, many years, and we had been allowing access by foreign nationals to that information for many, many years. So we found out a couple of years ago that it was in fact controlled, and that resulted in us having to make a disclosure to the government because it was an export control violation. We had controlled information in this lab, we were sharing it with foreign nationals, and that's an export control violation. What I'll also say about that is unfair as this seems and is this going to sound, it's not up to the provider of that technology to tell us that it's controlled. We are obligated under the regulations to know if we are working with something controlled. So they transferred to us controlled technology. They said it was proprietary. They did not say it was export controlled, but it's still on us. So that is what it is. We made the disclosure. That got us a visit from the Department of Commerce. An agent came and I met with him, and we talked about our program and what we were doing to kind of put in place some measures to make sure that didn't happen again, which included these changes to how we negotiate non-disclosure agreements and how we handle that. So again, work with me, work with your grant contract officer to determine if you're receiving controlled information, what that level of control is, and what the appropriate security measures are. I'll also say this, we do not prohibit export controlled information on our campus. All we ask is that if somebody wants to give us controlled information to do our research, we're going to put in place a technology control plan. And that's just to make sure that we have a documentation of who's going to have access to it, how it's going to be secured, so we don't have either an inadvertent or an unintentional disclosure to someone that isn't allowed to have access under the law. I have a technology control plan template, and I will work with you on putting that in place. So again, not an insurmountable hill by any means, just a little additional paperwork, a little additional effort on all of our parts. I put this here, minimize the receipt of proprietary information. You know, in my role as export control officer, I would love it if we said, you know, we don't actually really want to receive proprietary information. It just puts us at risk, frankly, every time we receive it, from an export control standpoint, but also, you know, just frankly, you have a duty to protect proprietary information, whether it's controlled or not. So every time we receive that, we have to make sure we're protecting it and we're handling it accordingly, export controlled or not. So I would like to err on the side of, you know, receiving as little proprietary information as absolutely necessary to do the research. Okay, restricted party screening. This is another way that we see that we handle export control compliance at Cornell. So a lot of people on this call probably have used a software program called Visual Compliance. And this is where we screen for those sanctioned and embargoed entities. So before OSP enters into a contract, before procurement enters into a purchase order with a vendor, before finance sends a payment to someone, we are screening these parties in visual compliance to make sure we're not breaking the laws by engaging with them. And you know, visual compliance has a compilation of hundreds of restricted party lists, ranging from foreign restricted party lists to GSA restricted party lists to government restricted party lists. So there's different levels of restricted party lists. There are some lists that are absolutely no, we will not work with you. There are some that are, well, this could be a warning sign, we need to talk about it. So visual compliance is a wonderful tool. We use it a lot here. If you would like to use it and you're not currently using it, come talk to me and we can get you set up with that. Okay. Visitors. This is a best practice. I received this question before. They say, well, is this mandatory? No, it's not mandatory, but is the export control officer, this is best practice. PIs should know who is in their lab at all times. There should not be random people coming into a lab, especially a lab that has any sort of proprietary information in it. Records should be kept of the visitors, where they're from, their date, their name, the date that they came, and the purpose of their visit. All visitors and their affiliation should be screened in visual compliance. Again, this is a nice, I suggest it. I would like to see everyone doing it. I know it's not what is going to happen in every case, but I think it's a really good idea to help us, you know, again, maintain compliance. Screening can be done by your department HR representative or by me. I've had people call me up and say, hey, my PI invited 15 people from a foreign country to come visit his lab tomorrow. Would you mind doing a quick screening of those names, visual compliance, to make sure nobody's on a, you know, a government list somewhere? And so I'm happy to do that. Visitors cannot have access to any proprietary, confidential, or controlled information. Whether it is export controlled or not, visitors cannot even see proprietary information. So again, this is back to that information you have received from a third party. Make sure that it is secured and out of sight in all cases. International shipments. Contact me as early as possible prior to making an international shipment. I would rather you check with me than just guess. I would rather, you know, I'd rather you ask what you think might be a stupid question, but is actually not a stupid question, because export control compliance is really so much more important than a stupid question, than just go ahead without knowing. You would be really surprised at the number of things that are controlled and that require a license to ship abroad. Genetic material, plasmids, you know, like I said, cell phones are controlled, computers are controlled, basic software programs are controlled, pens and pencils are controlled, but I will say pen and pencil you can send to almost any country other than Iran, Syria, Cuba, North Korea, and the Crimea region of Ukraine. But again, check with me. And even if we do need a license, again, fairly standard process, does not take me long to do, and we expect a 30 to 60 day turnaround time to get most licenses. We have a customs agent, Mohawk Global Logistics. They have Cornell's power of attorney to expedite clearing of shipments leaving and entering the United States. So I've put their information there. If you'd like to utilize them for custom clearance, they are there. Here I put some country specific resources. So if you know, a lot of you probably have heard that China has been in the news lately. So we put together, myself in conjunction with the Global Operations Group and the Vice Provost for International Affairs, have put together this China FAQ for specific questions regarding engaging with China. I, you know, highly suggest you take a look at that if you're working with a Chinese entity. I've also put together this Iran sanctions guidance document, which is on the export control page. And again, I put this together because of all the sanctioned countries, Iran seems to be the one that comes up the most and that people have the most questions about. So this was put together as a guide to sort of assist everyone. And again, highly encourage everyone to check that out if you think, yeah, if you're working with Iran or an entity in Iran. Okay, and that's all I have. So my information is here. The export control mailbox is here. The export control website is here. Like I said, I just really strongly encourage everyone to reach out to me. It is, I would much rather answer 20 questions a day than be in a situation where we have a violation of export control regulations. So please reach out to me with any and all questions. And I will also open it up to questions. And I see there is one in chat. So I will address this one first. The question is, what is technology? And that's a really good question. So when I say technology, technology is information. It's information. Technology is the stuff in your brain. It's the information needed for the design development or use of a controlled item. So these are works. These are design specifications. The regulations govern the transfer of technology to foreign nationals in the US and foreign nationals abroad. The regulations, for the most part, do not prohibit the transfer of controlled items to foreign nationals in the US, not abroad. Remember, if you're shipping something abroad, you got to come talk to me. If a transfer of something within the US, if it's just an export controlled item like a cell phone, something you can go down to Staples and buy, obviously that's not a problem. Again, proprietary technology is what we're worried about, transfer to foreign nationals in the US. Another question, is there a place to check if something is export controlled? Yes, and there are links to this on my website, but I will tell you that it's very complex, and I'm happy to walk anyone through that offline. But you can also actually, there's a module in visual compliance that you can search, but I will tell you most of the time you're not going to have a black and white answer. So for example, it doesn't say Apple iPhones are controlled. It will say electronic consumer communication devices with a memory capacity of 65, whatever. So it's not like cut and dry. Another good way to find out if something is controlled if you're procuring it from somebody is to ask the entity that you're procuring it from. They should have that information. Another question, will I share these presentation in slides? Yes, I believe. Gail can correct me if I'm wrong, but if you don't get it, it will definitely be on our website, or again, just reach out to me and I'll send it to you. I'm happy to share this stuff.
Yes, I just posted the website link where the presentation will be posted later today.
Perfect. Thank you, Gail.
Sure.
Is the fundamental research exclusion project specific? Yes, it is. We can have 100 projects that are fundamental research and one project that is not. I'll just say by policy, Cornell does not do controlled research, but yes, fundamental research is project specific per the regulations. Per Cornell policy, we call ourselves a fundamental research institution because we only take fundamental research projects, but the law, in terms of the law, it is project specific. Are there any exceptions specific to Canada? Yes and no. So the regulations, when you're shipping something to any country, whether or not you need a license is going to depend on the type of technology you're shipping and who you're shipping it to. So, for example, there are certain things that, like I said before, pens and pencils, they're so low level controlled that the regulations say you can send them anywhere other than those 5 sanctioned countries. There are certain things that there are no exceptions for. So for example, if you're sending biological materials, this is going to be any pathogen, toxin, a genetic element that codes for a pathogen or toxin. a plant pathogen, a fungus, a bacteria, those are almost, bacteria is iffy, but those are almost always going to be controlled to every single country. So yes and no on the Canada question. The difference between a PI working with controlled information versus a PI working on an export control project. Okay. We have a fair amount of PIs on this campus working with export controlled information. So remember I said earlier that if you receive controlled information from a third party to assist you in doing your research, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a technology control plan in place with you, with your department IT staff, to make sure that you're protecting that information appropriately. What that means is that you're using this export controlled information on one hand, but on the other hand, your project itself is not export controlled, because ultimately you're going to be publishing that research and you haven't accepted restrictions on your ability to share that research. So like I said, it's actually not terribly uncommon for this situation to occur. I'm working with export controlled information, but I'm not publishing that export controlled information from the third party. My research, my intellectual output is fundamental research and it's going to be shared. Alternatively, if we have accepted a controlled project, which we have not done to date at Cornell, and we don't have any plans to do so, but just hypothetically speaking, if we were working on a controlled project, that would be a much bigger hurdle to climb. It would mean possibly isolating even space in the building, because the whole research, the whole output, that would mean the conversations are controlled. That would mean the notes are controlled. That would mean phone calls. So that would be a whole nother hill to climb, and one we have not done at Cornell. And frankly, most US institutions don't do controlled work for a lot of reasons. For sponsored research agreements, you mentioned that there cannot be restrictions on publication. Is there a way to have a notification period? Yes, and that's a great question. There is an exception, well, not an exception, but there is a caveat in the regulations that say you still get to avail yourself of the fundamental research exclusion if you have language that says we will give the sponsor 30 days to review any publication for the sole purpose of identifying either their confidential information or patentable technology. So if they review that publication and they say, hey, you've shared my confidential information in there, that wasn't your research. Oh, fair enough, we'll take that out. Number two, they could say, there is patentable technology in there, and we would like to file a patent on that. Also okay. And in that case, we will delay publication for 60 to 90 days, or a reasonable amount of time for us to file that patent. Because remember, a patent does become part of the public domain. So ultimately, that is getting published. So yes, that's absolutely acceptable. Okay, that is all the questions I have in chat. Anybody else?
Anyone?
I think we're right at time. So like I said, please reach out to me anytime. No question is a bad question. So
Thank you, Sarah. That was a great presentation. And again, we'll have that presentation and the video loaded to the website later today. Next month's